You know, the power of origin stories is just immense, isn't it?
Mm,
They don't just give us a starting point in history. They really fundamentally shape who we think we are, our values, our collective memory.
absolutely. Every nation, every culture has them. But some stories are just woven so deeply into the fabric of a place, they become almost inseparable from, national consciousness itself.
And for Korea, that story, that real central pillar, is the Dangun Sinhwa.
Yeah, exactly. And this isn't some dusty old tale stuck in ancient books. It's a really dynamic myth. It's been a source of profound symbolism, yeah, but also some pretty heated debate. And a powerful tool for defining and, well, asserting Korean identity for, gosh, over 1,000 years, right up to today.
And that's what we're doing in this deep dive, right? We want to peel back those layers. We'll get into the core story, sure, but maybe more importantly, explore its variations across different times, the rich symbolism packed inside it, and its enduring and sometimes contested significance, how it shaped Korean culture, national identity, even the modern political scene in both North and South Korea. We'll be using the sources you've shared to guide us.
That's the plan. To pull out the most compelling insights, the key nuggets of knowledge from those sources, really, give you a shortcut to understanding why this Dangun myth is just so foundational and why it still resonates so strongly in Korea.
Okay, sounds good. Let's unpack this. So, right at the very beginning, the Dangun myth starts us off in the heavens. We begin with Hwanung. He's presented as the Lord of Heaven, right? The supreme deity.
That's right. Hwanun is up there in the celestial realm. But his importance here is really tied directly to his son, Hwanung. Hwanung's the one, the divine figure who looks down from heaven onto the human world.
And he wasn't just, like, sightseeing, was he? He had a specific reason for looking down.
Precisely. The sources tell us Hwanung wasn't just content hanging out in heaven. He had this deep desire, this pull, to descend and live among humans. And his vision wasn't just about coexisting. It was, the phrasing is often translated as to establish a human world, or bringing benefit to mankind, sometimes living among and enlightening people.
Ah.
It really signifies a divine intention to bring order, morality, a better way of life, to the earthly realm.
That's a really important distinction. It's not just a visit, it's a mission to create or improve society. So with this vision, he decides to come down. Where does he actually land?
Well, the most famous version, the one you find in the Samguk Yusa, that's the 13th century historical text, Memorabilia of the Three Kingdoms, it says Hwanung descended onto Mount Taebaek.
The Taebaek, okay.
And specifically, it mentions he landed under a sacred sandalwood tree. It's often called the shrine tree or divine tree. Even the location is symbolic. Mountains like Taebaek are often seen as these cosmic connection points, between heaven and earth.
And he definitely didn't arrive alone. This descent was clearly the start of something big.
Oh, absolutely. To fulfill that vision, establishing a human world, Hwanung came down with a pretty substantial group, 3,000 followers.
3,000, wow.
Yeah, which suggests that right from the start, this wasn't just about a single ruler. It was about founding a community, laying the groundwork for a society.
And he brought these really symbolic objects with him. The three seals of heaven, what were those?
Ah, yes, the Chanwinin. Well, their exact nature, what they actually were, is kind of debated by scholars. Were they physical things like mirrors, swords, beads, like some traditions say? Or maybe something more abstract, representing divine authority? But whatever they were, their function seems clear. They symbolize Hwanung's divine right to rule, his legitimacy, granted by heaven itself. They represent the heavenly mandate for his mission on earth and the authority he needed to establish and govern this new human world.
So he lands on Mount Taebaek. He's got followers, divine authority symbolized by the seals. What's the first thing he does when he gets there?
His main task was bringing order, establishing order in the world. The myth says he ruled over human affairs. Now, the text doesn't list everything, but it specifically mentions he oversaw the ministers of wind, rain, and clouds.
Wind, rain, and clouds.
Yeah.
So agriculture, nature.
That's how it's often interpreted, yeah. A direct connection to agriculture, which is obviously essential for any early society, and control over the natural elements vital for life. But, on a deeper level, it signifies setting up the basic framework for civilization itself.
Right.
Setting laws, defining morality, creating the structures for people to live together and survive. And this is before any formal kingdom even exists. It highlights that the ideal foundation was meant to be one of divine order, ethical behavior, and being in harmony with nature.
So you've got this divine being descending, bringing followers authority, setting up the basics of a structured moral society tied to nature. And then something unexpected happens. Animals show up.
Yes, This is where we get the famous animal part of the myth. Two creatures living nearby in the wild, a tiger and a bear, they approached Hwanung. And they weren't just bumping into him, they had a deep desire. They wanted to become human. They actually prayed to Hwanung, asking him to make this happen.
They wanted to transform, and Hwanung gives them a test. A pretty legendary trial, from what I remember.
Exactly. He gives them a challenge that's both physically really tough and deeply symbolic. They had to go into a cave, live in total darkness away from sunlight, and survive on a really meager diet. Just mugwort and garlic for 100 days.
Mugwort and garlic, that's specific, and pretty unappetizing for 100 days.
It certainly is. And the difficulty is exactly the point. This wasn't just about, enduring hunger or the discomfort of a deer cave. It was a profound test, a test of discipline, of patience, of perseverance.
Could they suppress their wild instincts?
Right. Their natural habits, hunting, seeking sunlight, all of that. Could they endure this hardship for a higher goal, becoming human, becoming part of this new order world Hwanung was trying to build?
It sounds almost like a test of whether they were capable of shedding that wildness for civilization, right?
Precisely. It's a demanding transformation. It requires immense willpower, the ability to follow rules, to endure discomfort for a long-term goal.
And the outcomes. Very different for the two animals.
Very different. The tiger, well, it lacked the necessary patience, the discipline. It gave up pretty quickly, apparently. It couldn't handle the strict conditions, the diet, so it left the cave, failed the test.
But the bear stuck it out.
The bear did. The myth says that after enduring this difficult process, and the Samguk Yusa version often specifically mentions 21 days within that 100-day trial, the bear succeeded. And the result? A miraculous transformation. The bear became a woman.
Wow.
And she's known as Ungnyeo, which literally means bear woman.
That transformation, bear to woman, that feels incredibly symbolic.
Oh, it is. Hugely. It represents the success born from that tough trial of discipline and endurance. It suggests that becoming truly human, or maybe capable of living in this new ordered society, wasn't just automatic. It required effort, shedding a more primal nature, adhering to rules. It's a demanding transition, symbolizing maybe not just individual change, but the broader effort needed to build a civilized society from something, well, wilder.
So the core story sets up this divine descent, the goal of building an ordered human world, and this tough test of transformation that brings an earthly element, the bear, maybe representing the land itself or local tribes, into this new divine human sphere.
Exactly. And that transformation is the direct link, the bridge to the next really crucial part of the myth.
Which is the birth of Dangun himself, the figure who actually founds the kingdom. So Ungnyeo is human now, but the story says she was still alone and wanted a child.
Yes. Now, in her human form, she apparently went back to that same sacred tree, the sandalwood tree where Hwanung had descended, and she prayed. She expressed her longing to have a child.
And Hwanung himself took her as his wife. This union feels absolutely central to the whole myth's power.
It is. It's a pivotal moment, really. The union of Hwanung, the heavenly being, son of the Lord of Heaven, with Ungnyeo, the earthly being, transformed from a bear. It represents the merging of the celestial and the terrestrial, heaven and earth coming together.
Right.
Dangun is born from this sacred pairing, and that solidifies this direct connection between the Korean people, the nation, and both the divine cosmos and the earth itself. Ungnyeo embodies that link to the land and, as some scholars think, maybe represents the assimilation of a powerful local tribe, symbolized by the bear, into this new social structure Hwanung was leading.
Now, you mentioned earlier there was a variation in the early accounts. The Samguk Yusa gives us Hwanung marrying Ungnyeo. What's the alternative version?
Yeah, this is where you really see the myth wasn't set in stone, even in its earliest written forms. The Chwangwungi, that is the songs of emperors and kings, put together by Yu Sung-hyu, just a few years after the Samguk Yusa, late 13th century, it presents a distinctly different lineage for Dangun. In the Chwangwungi, there's no bear or tiger story at all. It's completely absent. Instead, it's Hwanung's granddaughter, who is divine but becomes human, who marries the spirit of the pactal tree itself. That sacred sandalwood tree where Hwanung landed.
Okay, so the divine link is still there, but through Hwanung's granddaughter marrying a tree spirit, not Hwanung marrying the transformed bear.
Exactly. So this alternative version, it emphasizes a matrilineal connection back to the ultimate divine ancestor, Hwanung, Hwanung to Hwanung's granddaughter, and it also links the ancestry directly to the sacred tree, the symbol of the descent, the physical place of origin.
Interesting.
But while this version exists and it's in an important early text, the Ungnyeo story from the Samguk Yusa, that's the one that really gained traction and became the dominant narrative over the centuries.
It's fascinating that there wasn't just one single accepted story even back then. And it wasn't just the plot details that differed, but even something as basic as Dangun's name, right?
That's right. Even the Chinese character used for Pan in Dangun's name actually varied between those two key texts. The Samguk Yusa used the character Tik, which means altar, maybe suggesting a connection to religious rites or a sacred place. But the Chuangungi used the character A, which means sandalwood tree, directly linking him to that sacred pactal tree in their version of the story.
And the tree character won out.
Yeah, over time, the tree character, A, became the standard one used for Dangun. These differences, they seem small, maybe a character here, a plot twist there, but they really highlight that the myth was being actively interpreted and recorded differently, probably based on different oral traditions or the specific perspectives of the people writing them down, even in the same historical era.
But despite these variations, the core result is the same: the birth of Dangun Wanggeom.
Yes, that's the culmination, the divine and earthly union, however you frame it. Dangun Wanggeom is born, inheriting this unique dual lineage. That makes him perfectly suited, mythologically speaking, to rule this new world Hwanung started setting up.
And he's the one credited with founding the very first Korean kingdom.
Gojoseon, yeah. The myth places the founding of Gojoseon way back in 2333 BCE. That date is still symbolically huge today. Dangun Wanggeom is the legendary founder, the first ruler. The story says he initially set up his capital at Mount Taebaek, probably near where Hwanung landed, reinforcing that connection to the sacred starting point.
But he moved it later.
Right. Later, he moved the capital to Pyongyang, which is identified as Asadal, though sometimes Asadal is also associated with Mount Gu. This act, establishing the kingdom, setting up its capital, it formalizes that ordered, moral, human world Hwanung envisioned into an actual political entity. It marks the mythological beginning of Korean history, Korean nationhood.
So that's the core story, the early variations: divine descent, a tough transformation, a sacred union of heaven and earth, culminating in Dangun founding the first kingdom based on order and morality. But here's where it gets, as you said, really interesting. The story's meaning, its significance, it didn't just stay static. It went through some pretty dramatic shifts, especially during the Joseon dynasty.
Oh, absolutely. The Joseon period, roughly 1392 to 1897, was heavily influenced by Neo-Confucianism. That became the dominant state ideology, and this had a huge impact on how history and origin myths were viewed. It led to a significant marginalization or downplaying of the Dangun myth, especially in official scholarly circles.
So Dangun got pushed aside. Who was elevated instead?
Kija. Kija was a figure from Chinese tradition. Now, according to Korean historical accounts that were heavily adopted during Gojoseon, Kija was supposedly a nobleman from China's Shang dynasty who fled to Korea after the Zhou conquest, and he was credited with bringing civilization to the peninsula.
Civilization-like.
Things like agriculture, silk farming, and most importantly, these 9 principles of universal norms, the Hangum Kuju.
9 principles. What were they basically?
They were essentially a set of ethical and governmental rules from a classic Chinese text. They emphasized moral governance, social harmony, proper relationships, classic Confucian ideals. So by emphasizing Kija, Gojoseon scholars were, in effect, linking the origins of Korean civilization directly to Chinese culture and the Confucian ideal of moral, orderly rule.
So prioritizing Kija over Dangun wasn't just like an academic preference. It was deeply political and philosophical, wasn't it?
Exactly. For a lot of Joseon scholars, aligning Korea's origins with Kija and Chinese Confucianism was a way to legitimize their own Neo-Confucian state. It presented Korea as part of the larger, civilized East Asian world centered on China, and it also served a strategic purpose, too.
How so?
Well, especially after the Ming dynasty fell to the Manchu Qing dynasty in China, asserting this connection to the proper Chinese Confucian tradition through Kija allowed Joseon elites to feel like they were preserving a purer form of civilization compared to the Manchu rulers of China.
All right.
And Dangun? Well, with his divine origins, the whole bear transformation thing, his connection to maybe older indigenous spiritual practices, He just didn't fit as neatly into a strict Neo-Confucian worldview that valued reason, order, and classical learning rooted in Chinese texts. Kija seemed more respectable, more aligned with their values.
So Dangun wasn't totally erased, but he was definitely sidelined for this more civilized, Confucian-friendly origin story.
Precisely. He wasn't officially denied, but the spotlight shifted dramatically. Debates did continue among scholars, though. They wrestled with questions about Dangun's historicity. Was he a real person? A symbol? How could he possibly have lived as long as some accounts claimed?
Yeah, like thousands of years, right?
Exactly. Some scholars tried to rationalize it, interpreting his extraordinary age as representing a whole lineage of rulers, not just one guy, to make it fit better with historical timelines. And the idea that he eventually became a mountain spirit, that was also debated. What was his ultimate fate, his nature?
But some people pushed back.
Oh, yes. Figures like Ho Chmok, for example, did champion Dangun. They argued against the overwhelming focus on Kija, pushing for Dangun's significance as the true, independent founder of the nation. But the prevailing scholarly and official view for much of Joseon really favored the Kija narrative.
Also seems like Dangun kept a strong regional importance, even when he was marginalized nationally.
Yes, that's a really important point. Dangun maintained this strong, enduring link to the Pyongyang area. We have records from as early as the late 13th century talking about the Samshung Shrine, the Shrine of Three Sacred Ones near Pyongyang in the Mount Kugel area.
And that was dedicated to
Hwanung, and Dangun, the whole founding lineage. So this shows a long-standing, localized veneration of these figures in that specific region. It suggests that even while Joseon intellectuals were debating Dangun's historical place and focusing on Kija, there were communities, maybe tied to older religious practices, who continued to honor him as central to their local history and spirituality.
So he sort of fades into the background during Joseon, but then makes this huge comeback in the modern era, especially tied up with Korean nationalism.
He absolutely does. And this resurgence is critical for understanding modern Korean identity. The late 19th, early 20th centuries, this was a time of intense national crisis, right? Culminating in Japanese colonial rule. Under that pressure, Korean identity, Korean history, they became battlegrounds. People were desperately seeking ways to define and assert an independent Korean nationhood, separate from both historical Chinese influence and current Japanese domination.
And this is where the Taeyongyo religion really stepped
A
in.
massive role, yeah. Taeyongyo, founded in 1909, explicitly presented itself as reviving Korea's original indigenous religion, tracing its roots directly back to Dangun. They actively campaigned to put Dangun back in his central place in Korean history and consciousness.
How did they actually do that? What was their strategy?
Well, they basically engaged in this huge project of historical and religious reconstruction. They produced their own texts, which they claimed were the true lost scriptures from Dangun's time. For example, the Samilsingo that was presented as Dangun's original teachings on ethics and the cosmos, and the Sindensilgi was their version of an official history of the Dangun era, the Gojoseon kingdom.
So they weren't just reinterpreting old texts, they were actually creating new ones.
Exactly. And they weren't afraid to reimagine parts of the myth to fit their own theological and nationalist goals. In some of their scriptures, they actually dropped elements they found maybe problematic or less suitable for a formal religion, like the bear transformation.
Really? They dropped the bear.
Sometimes, yeah. Presenting Dangun instead as more of an embodiment of an abstract heavenly spirit or national ancestor, rather than the son of a transformed animal. They also created these incredibly detailed genealogies, listing not just one Dangun, but a whole lineage of 47 Dangun rulers.
47.
Yep. Trying to give historical weight and continuity to their claimed lineage all the way back to the mythical founder.
This sounds like where the idea of manufacturing sources comes into play.
Precisely. To back up these claims, the long lineage, the continuous history starting with Dangun Taeyongyo and historians associated with them sometimes, well, manufactured historical sources or interpreted existing ones in ways that were pretty unconventional, let's say, to validate their narrative.
Why? What was the goal?
It was a deliberate effort. They wanted to write Dangun and Gojoseon back into historical prominence. They were pushing back against the Joseon focus on Kija and against Japanese colonial attempts to portray Korea as historically dependent or culturally minor. They even coined the name Peiral as an alternative name for the Korean nation, explicitly linking it to this ancient history they were constructing around Dangun.
So history itself became a tool, almost like a weapon, for national assertion against colonialism and historical neglect.
It absolutely did. And this project fit perfectly with the work of nationalist historians like Sinhwa and Park Yun-sik. These scholars fiercely embraced Dangun. He was the true, singular founder, the symbol of an independent Korean identity. They actively rejected any notion that Kijo was important.
Because acknowledging Kija implied dependency on China.
Exactly, which they saw as harmful to Korean national pride and the fight for independence. Sinchayo especially saw Dangun not just as a founder king, but as this great conqueror, the originator of Korea's unique indigenous religion, Ungnyeo, which he argued got suppressed later by foreign influences like Confucianism and Buddhism. His argument was basically, look, if you're going to dismiss the Dangun story as just a myth, then you have to dismiss the Kijo story too. Clear the slate and emphasize a purely Korean origin.
It really sounds like this period cemented Dangun's position as the national ancestor, the symbol of an ancient independent lineage for modern Korea.
It absolutely did. The combination of this religious revivalism from Taejongyo and the passionate work of nationalist historians elevated Dangun to a level of prominence he hadn't had before. He became the central figure in the story of Korean origins and resistance.
Now, beyond these historical and nationalist views, scholars have also looked at the myth through other lenses, right? Different academic perspectives.
Oh yeah, it's been incredibly fertile ground for academic interpretation. Some scholars look at the bear and the tiger and see them as representing actual ancient tribal groups.
Like a bear tribe and a tiger tribe.
Exactly, suggesting the myth might reflect the assimilation or maybe the dominance of a bear tribe over a tiger tribe. The union of Hwanung and Ungnyeo could symbolize intermarriage between groups or a political alliance.
Interesting. Any other takes?
Well, others, particularly coming from a Marxist perspective, have interpreted the myth as maybe an allegory, representing the transition from a more primitive society, maybe shamanistic, maybe even matriarchal, to a more organized state-level society led by a patriarchal figure like Dangun.
So the myth isn't just history or legend. It could be encoding information about early social structures and how they changed.
That's the idea. It serves as this incredibly complex, multi-layered text. Different historical periods, political ideologies, academic theories, they've all projected their own interpretations onto it and found meaning relevant to their own time and concerns.
Okay, let's circle back to the symbolism within the core story itself, because it feels so rich. We touched on that divine and earthly connection through Dangun's birth.
That is arguably the most powerful piece of symbolism in the whole thing. Dangun, being the child of Hwanung from heaven and Ungnyeo from the earth via the bear, fundamentally links the Korean people, the Korean nation, directly to both the cosmos and the land. It's a dual lineage.
Implying the divine isn't distant, but connected right to the physical world and its people.
Yes, exactly. It gives the Korean people this unique, sacred ancestry rooted simultaneously in the celestial and the terrestrial. It bestows a kind of inherent sacredness on Korean identity itself, tied directly to the land.
In the animal symbolism, the bear and the tiger.
Yeah, that carries a lot of weight, too. As we discussed, the bear succeeding through discipline and endurance symbolizes qualities seen as essential for building a settled society, right? Patience, resilience, self-control, the ability to transform.
While the tiger failing highlights the opposite.
Right. Impatience, maybe an inability to adapt to the demands of this new order, perhaps representing a group or a way of life that just wasn't compatible with the emerging civilization.
And what about Hwanung setting up laws and governing before Dangun is even born? What's the significance there?
That emphasizes that the kingdom Dangun eventually founds wasn't built out of nowhere, out of chaos. It was intended from the very start to be based on principles of divine order, morality, and good governance established right at the beginning by Hwanung. Those three seals of heaven symbolize the divine authority, the legitimacy underpinning that whole foundational order.
So they're not just random rules.
No, they're presented as divinely sanctioned principles for how human society should work. The bedrock ideals for the Korean nation, right from its mythical conception.
So the myth is basically an origin story for the nation's core values, as much as for its people.
I think that's a great way to put it. And this brings us right to its profound cultural significance. Beyond just being a historical account or a mythological tale, the Dangun myth is absolutely central to Korean identity. It provides this incredibly powerful narrative of collective origin, tracing the lineage of all Korean people back to one common sacred ancestor.
Which forms a basis for ethnic nationalism, that sense of shared identity.
It certainly does. That idea of a shared lineage, starting from this sacred union, fosters a really strong sense of collective identity, of kinship. Now, that concept has been interpreted and sometimes, frankly, misused in different historical and political contexts. But the core idea of tracing ancestry back to Dangun has been a powerful unifying force. It contributes to a sense of shared history, shared heritage.
And perhaps most critically, it stood as a symbol of independence.
Crucially so. By presenting Korean civilization as having these deep, divine origins, completely separate from outside powers, a direct line from heaven and earth, not through some intermediary like Kija coming from China, the myth became an incredibly potent symbol of Korean autonomy.
Especially when independence was threatened.
Exactly. It provided a powerful counter-narrative to any claims of historical dependency or cultural inferiority coming from neighboring powers. It asserted Korea's unique, ancient, and divinely sanctioned origins.
And this significance absolutely continues today, though its meaning is still very much alive, debated, particularly across the North-South divide.
It remains a living, contested narrative.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Let's look at South Korea first. You have Gojoseon National Foundation Day celebrated every October 3rd. It commemorates Hwanung's descent to Earth, seen as the symbolic beginning of the nation.
It's a major public holiday, right? Huge national holiday. It acknowledges this event as the starting point of Korean history and nationhood. Now, while it definitely has roots in indigenous religious practices, today it's largely observed as a civic holiday. A day to remember the nation's origins, distinct from the specific religious practices of groups like Taejongyo.
And you mentioned the Dangun calendar was even used officially for a while in the South.
That's right. For a time after the Republic of Korea was established, the official calendar actually used the Dangun era, dating from 2333 BCE. It was a very conscious choice, you know. Asserting a break from the colonial period, which used the Japanese calendar, and returning to a uniquely Korean system rooted in this indigenous origin myth.
But that changed.
It did. In 1961, under the military government that led to Park Chung-hee's rule, the Dangun calendar was abolished. South Korea officially adopted the Gregorian calendar. The justification was about modernization, aligning Korea with international standards. It reflected a shift in national focus towards economic development, the miracle of the Han River, and geopolitical alignment with the West. While Park Chung-hee's relationship with traditional culture was complex, he sometimes saw it as hindering progress. But he also apparently considered building a massive Dangun statue at one point, though that got dropped partly due to Christian opposition. The calendar change symbolized a move away from purely indigenous historical markers towards a more globally integrated view.
So in South Korea today, Dangun is acknowledged culturally, celebrated on a holiday, but modern identity is also really shaped by things like democracy, economic success, global ties.
Exactly. The myth is part of the cultural backdrop, taught in schools, definitely, but it exists alongside and is often interpreted through the lens of modern values and priorities.
How does North Korea handle Dangun? It seems like a very different approach.
Oh, completely different. North Korea has given Dangun a much more central and overtly political role, especially since the 1990s. They've actively tried to historicize him, asserting he was a real historical figure, not just a myth. Their most famous move was claiming they actually excavated Dangun's tomb near Pyongyang back in 1993.
Excavated his tomb. That sounds, well, highly symbolic, maybe even staged.
It was certainly viewed with skepticism internationally, but following this alleged discovery, they built a massive grand mausoleum at the site. Now, by claiming to find his tomb and centering it geographically right near Pyongyang, they're making a very powerful political statement.
What's the statement?
They're asserting that Dangun was real, the historical founder of a powerful ancient state, Gojoseon, and that this state was centered right there in the Pyongyang region, linking it to the ancient Taedonggang culture of that area.
And how does that fit into North Korea's ideology?
It feeds directly into the Juve ideology, that idea of national subjectivity, self-reliance. It serves several purposes. First, claiming Dangun as a real ancient founder based in Pyongyang gives deep historical legitimacy to the North Korean state itself. It positions the regime as the direct inheritor of the true ancient Korean legacy.
And implies the South is less legitimate.
That's the implication. By centering the origin in Pyongyang, they reinforce their claim that North Korea represents the original, authentic core of the Korean nation. It frames South Korea as somehow deviated. Third, presenting Gojoseon under Dangun as this powerful ancient state aligns perfectly with the Juche narrative of a strong, independent Korean nation resisting outsiders from the very beginning. It ties the current regime's power back to this long, supposedly unbroken line of strong Korean leadership originating in the north. They often portray North Korea as representing the pure form of Korean ethnicity, and this deep historical root near Pyongyang is used to back that up.
It's really incredible how the exact same foundational myth gets used in such opposite ways by the two Koreas, reflecting their completely different political systems and national stories.
It really underscores that origin myths aren't static endpoints, they're dynamic resources. The Dangun myth is still this significant site of contestation, of interpretation. Historians debate it, political regimes use it to prop up their narratives, and it reflects fundamentally different ideas about what it means to be Korean, where the nation came from, and where it's going. Its meaning is constantly being negotiated, redefined, based on today's needs and political goals.
And these reinterpretations weren't just internal Korean debates, right?
Yeah.
The myth got tangled up in interactions with other countries, particularly Japan.
Absolutely. And this is a really striking example of how a national myth can become a battleground internationally. Around the late 19th, early 20th century, as Japan's imperial power in Korea was growing, some Japanese scholars, academics, even Shinto figures started engaging with the Dangun myth in ways that were deeply offensive to Koreans.
How were they interpreting it? What were they saying?
They basically tried to appropriate it. They suggested it was somehow related to or even derived from Japanese mythology. There were specific claims trying to link Dangun to the Japanese god Susanoo, for example, proposing a common origin for Koreans and Japanese, or even suggesting Dangun was somehow connected to the Japanese imperial line.
And this wasn't just academic curiosity, was it?
Yeah.
This was tied to Japan's expansionist plans.
Precisely. This wasn't just intellectual debate. By claiming a shared ancestry or linking Korea's founding myth to Japanese figures, it was a deliberate strategy. It aimed at culturally absorbing Korea. The underlying message was that Korea wasn't truly independent with its own unique origins, but was historically or mythically connected to, maybe even an offspring of, Japan.
Providing a cultural excuse for annexation.
Exactly. A justification for colonial rule. Some Japanese Shintoists even tried to enshrine Dangun in Shinto shrines in Korea as part of an effort to assimilate Korean indigenous spirituality into their imperial Shinto system.
Wow. And how did Koreans react to that, this blatant cultural appropriation?
The reaction from Korean nationalists, from religious groups like Taejongyo, was fierce rejection, outrage. For them, Dangun was the sacred, exclusively Korean ancestor, the ultimate symbol of Korean identity and independence. These Japanese claims weren't just seen as historical distortions, they were seen as a direct attack on the very soul of the Korean nation.
So resisting those interpretations became an act of resistance itself.
A powerful act of national resistance, yeah.
Yeah.
It really solidified Dangun's position as this inviolable symbol of Korean autonomy and distinctiveness.
It's amazing how the myth became such a focal point for resisting colonial cultural pressure. Were there other transnational religious interpretations happening too?
Yes, Western missionaries also engaged with the myth, though obviously with a very different goal. As Christianity was being introduced in Korea, some missionaries looked for ways to make it seem less foreign, more acceptable to Koreans. They tried to find parallels, motifs within the Dangun myth that they could connect to Christian theology.
What kind of parallels did they try to draw?
Well, they explored ideas like maybe Hwanung, and Dangun represented a kind of Korean Trinity, or seeing Dangun himself as a sort of Christ-like figure, a heavenly being descending to earth for the salvation or betterment of humanity. Some thought they saw hints of an indigenous monotheism that predated Christianity.
Trying to bridge the gap.
Exactly. The aim was to show that Christianity wasn't entirely alien, that it could be seen as compatible with, maybe even the fulfillment of, an existing Korean spiritual tradition represented by the Dangun myth. It was a strategy to connect with Korean culture rather than just replace it.
So the myth wasn't just interpreted internally for national or religious reasons. Outsiders were also trying to fit into their own frameworks, whether for political control or religious conversion.
Exactly right. It really highlights the myth's prominence. It was this foundational story that any group trying to engage with or influence Korean society really had to grapple with and interpret somehow. And this whole process, interpreting, debating, sometimes even manufacturing historical claims about Dangun, it became deeply intertwined with building national identity and religious feeling, especially within groups like Taejongyo. The sources actually describe this process as turning the production of history into a sacred endeavor.
Sacred endeavor. What exactly does that mean in this context?
It means that for groups like Taijonggu, studying Dangun, writing about him, spreading his story, it wasn't just academic work or telling tales, it was a spiritual act. It was a way of affirming their faith, their identity. History itself, especially the history of Dangun and the nation's founding, became almost holy. An inviolable object of belief that needed constant affirmation, defense, commemoration.
So producing texts or genealogies wasn't just recording history.
It was performing a religious duty, solidifying a sacred past and a divinely ordained national identity, especially when facing colonial attempts to erase or twist that past.
Wow. Okay. So pulling all these incredible layers together, what's the core message here? What should we really take away from this deep dive into the Dangun Sinhwa? What does it all boil down to?
I think the single most important takeaway is that the Dangun myth is just fundamentally more than an ancient origin story. It's an incredibly dynamic foundational narrative. It's been constantly interpreted, reinterpreted, debated, and frankly wielded as a powerful tool across centuries, across political divides.
It's not static history. It's a living cultural and political force.
Precisely. It reflects core beliefs about the Korean people's unique connection to the divine, yes, but also to the earthly realm. It embodies those foundational ideals the myth lays out. Discipline, order, morality for the nation. And it has served as this incredibly potent symbol of national identity, of independence, of historical legitimacy, especially when Korea faced external pressure.
And its lasting power comes from that adaptability,
Yeah.
its ability to be shaped by different groups for their own visions of Korea.
Yes, absolutely. Its ability to be molded by ancient writers, by Gojoseon scholars, by modern nationalists, by religious groups, even by contemporary political regimes in both North and South Korea. That's what has kept it so relevant, so central to Korean identity today. It speaks to those fundamental questions. Who are Koreans? Where do they come from? And its meaning is still being actively negotiated right now in the present.
This whole exploration of the Dangun Sinhwa really drives home how origin myths aren't just quaint relics of the past, are they? They are living narratives. They continue to shape national consciousness, define identity, serve as powerful tools for historical and political claims, and even become sites of international arguments in the modern world.
They really are the bedrock stories, aren't they? The ones communities keep returning to again and again, finding new layers of meaning, new purpose in them, depending on the challenges and the hopes of their own time.
That definitely leaves you with something to think about as you go about your day. What other foundational stories, maybe ones you haven't thought much about, are playing a similar, perhaps unseen, role in contemporary society around the globe? Quietly shaping national identities, maybe influencing political narratives right under our noses? Think about that. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.